The moment the engine went silent, the airfield seemed to hold its breath. A thin trail of white vapor drifted from the cowling suite with the sharp scent of glycol, and the ground crew knew exactly what it meant. A pilot had pushed his luck against the limits of a machine built to be brilliant and fragile. Out on those fog-stained runways of 1944, men didn't fear the enemy they could see. They feared the flaw hidden inside the aircraft they trusted with their lives. For all its grace in the sky, the P-51 Mustang carried a weakness that no amount of courage could overcome. A single strike to its exposed cooling system, just a puncture the size of a pencil tip, could turn a mission into a countdown measured in degrees Celsius. Inside that sleek fuselage beat a liquid-cooled engine that delivered unmatched performance but demanded perfection. And in war, perfection rarely survived first contact. So the question lingered over every takeoff. How could one of the finest fighters ever built also be undone by a single bullet? And more importantly, what did that truth mean for the men who flew it straight into the heart of Europe? Long before the white vapor trails became a familiar warning, the promise of the P-51 Mustang was almost irresistible. It was the fighter every bomber crew wished to see above their formation, sleek, fast, and capable of escorting them all the way to Berlin and back. In the winter of 1943 to 44, as the air war over Europe reached its brutal peak, America needed a machine that could outfly and outlast the Luftwaffe. On paper, the Mustang was exactly that. In the air, it often proved even more. But hidden beneath its confidence was a fragility that only the ground crews truly understood. The design that made the Mustang extraordinary was also what made it vulnerable. Its liquid-cooled engine, the Packard-built Merlin, delivered the high-altitude performance the Allied bombing campaign desperately needed. But that power depended entirely on a cooling system, stretched through the aircraft like exposed arteries. Ethylene glycol coursed through thin aluminum lines, passed through a radiator slung low in the belly scoop, and returned toward the engine through channels the designers believed would remain out of harm's way so long as the aircraft stayed high. Yet combat never obeys the neat assumptions of engineering. At Debden Airfield, Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell spent 7 months maintaining Mustangs. He knew their strengths, the laminate flow wings, the clean aerodynamics, the range that turned missions deep into Germany from impossible to inevitable. But he also knew their weakness, one he could inspect, tight, and test, but never truly defend. Every morning he checked the clamps along the cooling system, ran his hands over the radiator seams, and looked for the smallest sign of corrosion. Every evening he wrote his name on the maintenance log, knowing a single unseen flaw could decide whether a pilot lived or died. The first fatal reminder came in March 1944. Second Lieutenant David Chen Young, confident, careful, returned from a strafing run with a thin trail of white vapor behind his P-51 Mustang. A single rifle round had slipped through the belly skin and clipped a coolant line. Chen did everything right. He climbed for altitude, set his course for England, and watched the temperature needle climb past safe limits. The engine held for 18 minutes before seizing just miles from home. The official report blamed pilot judgment. Mitchell knew better. The liquid-cooled engine had failed because the system designed to protect it could not survive a grazing hit. 3 weeks later, it happened again. First Lieutenant William Morrison, experienced, disciplined, respected by everyone on the line, took a fragment from an 88mm shell. He kept formation long enough to protect the bombers, then broke off, hoping to reach the Dutch coast. His engine seized before he could settle onto the sand. 2 pilots, 2 missions, 2 losses from the same fragile link in the same cooling system. And these were only the beginning. By April 1944, the war in the air had shifted into a harsher rhythm. The Allied bombing campaign was pressing deeper into Germany, and the Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could train new ones. The sky over Europe belonged increasingly to the long-legged American escorts, and among them, none commanded more respect than the P-51 Mustang. Pilots trusted its speed, bomber crews trusted its range, commanders trusted its kill ratio. Only the ground crews feared what lay beneath its brilliance. On the morning of April 21st, Lieutenant James Parker walked toward his aircraft with the calm stride of a man who understood the risks but accepted them anyway. At 22, he had already flown 14 missions. He'd survived flak belts over Brunswick fighter swarms near Magdeburg and long returns over the North Sea with fuel gauges dipping into the margin of uncertainty. But what haunted him and the mechanics who kept him flying wasn't the enemy. It was the cooling system that could betray him at altitude, turning the liquid-cooled engine into a ticking clock. Parker's mission that day was a deep escort toward Parchim. Somewhere over the target, a burst of 88mm fire erupted inside the formation. When the smoke cleared, pilots saw a familiar white trail drifting behind Parker's Mustang. "Coolant hit," he radioed, "temperature rising." He stayed with the bombers long enough to push them through the flak zone, then turned west alone. Minutes later, he disappeared into the haze over western Germany. No bailout sighted, no crash reported. Mitchell counted the returning aircraft that afternoon. 15 landed, 1 did not. That missing tail number hollowed him out in a way he could not put into words. News like that travels fast along a flight line, and with it came quiet frustration. Rodriguez, another crew chief, began combing through maintenance logs. 42 P-51 losses in 3 months. 27 of them traced to the same cause hits that punctured the cooling system and left the liquid-cooled engine to overheat until it tore itself apart. These weren't pilots making tactical mistakes. Many had been at altitude. Many had followed doctrine to the letter. Ground fire simply reached them anyway. But while ground crews wrestled with patterns they could not change, the strategic picture was shifting above them. Late that April, Major General James Doolittle issued the order that rewrote the Mustang's role in the war. Fighters were no longer required to cling tightly to bomber formations. They could range ahead, sweep the skies, clean hunt enemy aircraft on the ground, and strike railways, airfields, and columns. To the pilots, it felt like freedom. To the ground crews, it felt like a sentence. Free roaming missions meant going low exactly where rifle rounds, machine guns, and flak fragments were most likely to hit the exposed radiator or coolant lines of the P-51 Mustang. The very mission profiles that showcased the aircraft's power also exposed its weakness. And almost immediately, the cost became clear. In May 1944 alone, 93 Mustangs were lost. 41% fell not to dogfights with German fighters, but to the merciless physics of a wounded cooling system. The aircraft dominating the sky was now being claimed by the ground. The deeper the Mustang flew into Europe, the more its pilots learned to listen to a sound no training manual had ever emphasized: the rising whine of a Merlin running too hot. It was the sound of a mission collapsing in real time. The sound of a pilot's world shrinking to a single gauge. And for many men, it was the beginning of their final minutes. One of those men was Lieutenant Robert Hayes. On May 19, 1944, Hayes rolled his P-51 Mustang into a strafing pass over a German convoy near Reims. His .50 caliber rounds lit the lead truck on fire, scattering soldiers along the roadside. As he pulled out of the dive, he felt a blunt kick beneath his left foot, as if someone had struck the floorboards from below. Then the temperature needle jumped. 5 degrees, 10, 15. He didn't need to smell the sweet trace of glycol to understand. The cooling system had taken a hit. At 4,000 feet, Hayes pointed his aircraft toward England. A white stream of vapor trailed behind him, visible from miles away. The liquid-cooled engine began its slow march toward failure. He reduced power to minimum cruise. The temperature steadied at 106 degrees Celsius, barely survivable. He calculated the distance home: 40 minutes, the margin 4 degrees. He had survived dogfights with Bf-109s, but now he was racing a needle, climbing one tick at a time. 8 minutes later, it began rising again. Hayes pushed the nose down, trading altitude for airflow. The gauge paused at 108 degrees Celsius, but the peace was temporary. At 112 degrees Celsius, the engine began to vibrate. At 114 degrees Celsius, the vapor trail shifted from white to gray burning coolant now. At 116 degrees Celsius, 3 miles from Debden, the propeller suddenly stopped. The silence hit him like a physical blow. But Hayes still had glide speed, still had altitude. He coaxed the powerless Mustang over the airfield boundary, dropped the gear, and touched down hard, but alive. The engine was destroyed, the aircraft barely saved, the pilot shaking but breathing. A single rifle round had almost erased him. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant William Davis lived the same nightmare. A pass over a German convoy near Caen, a hit he barely felt, a temperature jump he couldn't ignore, vapor pouring from the belly scoop, the desperate race home, and finally the inevitable engine seizure just miles from his base. He glided in, saving the airframe but sacrificing the engine another Merlin ruined after running dry. For the ground crews, these weren't isolated scares. They were part of a pattern, tightening like a noose. Between April and August 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 569 P-51 Mustang aircraft. 41% were lost during strafing missions. And most of those losses began the same way, with a puncture somewhere in the exposed web of the cooling system. A hole the size of a grain of rice, a trail of vapor, a pilot counting the seconds until the liquid-cooled engine locked solid. No amount of courage could fight physics, and physics was claiming pilots faster than the enemy. Long before historians traced the patterns on paper, the pilots of the 8th Air Force had already understood the quiet truth: survival in the air often came down to the engine strapped in front of them. And in that battlefield of altitude, heat, and chance, not all fighters were created equal. The P-47 Thunderbolt told one story. It absorbed punishment with the stubborn resilience of its air-cooled radial engine. Pilots returned with cylinders shot away, fins shattered, cowlings bent into jagged metal, yet the engines kept turning, kept hauling men home. No coolant meant no vulnerable arteries. Damage that would doom a P-51 Mustang barely slowed a Thunderbolt. The P-38 Lightning told another story. Twin engines, twin radiators, built-in redundancy. A Lightning could lose a cooling loop on one side and fly reliably on the other. Pilots called it the comfort of a second chance. Mustang pilots had no such luxury. When the cooling system began to fail, they weren't troubleshooting. They were calculating where they might die. This difference shaped strategy, whether headquarters admitted it or not. By mid-1944, when missions called for low-level strikes, rail yards, convoys, airfields, the U.S. command quietly leaned toward assigning P-47 units. It wasn't policy, it was survival math. A liquid-cooled engine simply could not take the hits that a radial could shrug off. And as losses mounted, ground crews and squadron leaders whispered the same phrase, "Use the machine built for the mission." Then came the visit from Edgar Schmood, the lead designer of the P-51 Mustang. He examined the wreckage, the torn coolant lines, the fragile radiators, and he did not deny what the crews already knew. The weakness had always been there. It was the cost of the Mustang's speed, its range, its precision. Armor, the radiator, thicken the lines, redesign the airflow, and you lose the fighter that turned the air war over Europe. A technical bulletin soon followed from Wright Field double clamp. Every joint check lines after each mission reduced power after suspected hits. But it offered no real fix because none existed without rebuilding the aircraft from the inside out. And that became the quiet lesson of the war. Great machines win battles, but their weaknesses, especially the ones engineered into them, shape how those battles are fought and who survives them. The P-51 Mustang, brilliant as it was, forced commanders, engineers, and pilots to confront a truth as old as warfare. A single flaw in a single design can echo across an entire theater. When the guns went quiet and Europe began to rebuild the men who had lived inside, the war carried their memories the way a pilot carries altitude carefully, knowing the smallest shift could change everything. For the mechanics and airmen who served alongside the P-51 Mustang, that memory came with the scent of glycol and the sound of an engine slipping past its final degree. The war ended, the machines were retired, but the truth of that fragile cooling system never faded. Robert Mitchell returned to Los Angeles and spent 4 decades repairing cars in a small garage tucked behind a row of storefronts. He rarely spoke about his wartime work. When people asked, he simply said he had been a mechanic in the service. He never mentioned the 19 pilots he had watched walk toward a sleek fighter powered by a liquid-cooled engine that could be undone by a single bullet. He never described the late nights tightening clamps, the mornings waiting for a formation to return, or the hollow silence of counting empty spaces on the ramp. Others carried the weight differently. Lieutenant Robert Hayes went home to Iowa, married, raised a family, and flew commercial routes for nearly 4 decades. But every spring when April 21st came around, he thought of James Parker, the pilot who flew into a column of flak with the same faith every Mustang pilot carried, trusting a machine that could outrun almost anything except its own vulnerability. Rodriguez stayed in the Air Force teaching young crew chiefs about jet engines. But he always told one story, the story of a fighter that was brilliant yet breakable, and the crews who tried to protect it. Years later, historians combed through the record's combat reports, maintenance logs, personal testimonies, and concluded what the crews had known in their bones. Hundreds of Mustangs had been lost not to superior enemy aircraft, but to the delicate architecture surrounding a single cooling system. The price of range and speed had been measured in human lives. And still the legend of the P-51 Mustang endured because history remembers what a machine achieved, not always what it cost. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies in the question it leaves behind. How should a nation weigh performance against protection? How many lives should be risked for innovation that wins battles but leaves no margin for error? If these stories move you, if the sacrifices behind the machines matter to you, join the conversation. Share what you believe the real lesson of the Mustang is. And if you want to explore more untold histories, more victories shaped by courage, more losses shaped by design, subscribe and stay with us. The war may be over, but the history is still being written.